He traveled around 80 countries, and those travels taught him the love for free market. Also, he was once detained by Polish police, but this is something he himself will hopefully tell us about. My name is Sebastian Stodolak, and today I have a pleasure to speak with Mr. Lawren Reed, President Emeritus of Foundation of Economic Education, which is the oldest American free market think tank. Good to have you with us, sir.
Thank you, Sebastian, and also thank you to the Warsaw Enterprise Institute. It's an honor to be with you.
Strange times we live in. You, Mr. love traveling, and here your prospects look rather poorly these days due to pandemic, of course.
Yes.
But all we have are memories right now. And speaking
Yes.
of memories, how do you recall your first or your visit in Poland in 1986?
That was my first of many visits to Poland, 1986, and it probably ranks as the most memorable visit that I have ever made to any of the 86 countries that I have been to. And that was because I spent my time with people who were active in the underground against the communist regime at that time. This was 1986, November, almost 3 years before the big changes in 1989. And every night I stayed at a different home with people who were in some way involved in trying to liberate the country from communist dictatorship. And I came away with a tremendous respect for the courage and the commitment of Polish people to—
Who did you meet with then?
Oh, many people. The primary host for my visit, who arranged the the stays at various different homes, was Jan Rokita, the founder of Freedom and Peace, who later became a very prominent member of your parliament. He put together most of the schedule, and he arranged for me to meet with people like Zbigniew and Sofia Romaszewski, who had run the underground radio for Solidarity in Warsaw in the first 6 months after martial law was declared in December of 1981. And many other people, mostly young people who were active at that time, quietly resisting the Polish regime. And some of them later went on to become members, elected members of the Polish parliament.
Do I remember correctly that you were involved into smuggling some free market literature into Poland?
Yes, both on that trip and subsequently after that trip. One of the visits that I made one evening was with a group of underground printers. And I was amazed at the examples they provided me of things that had been illegal in Poland, illegal to be translated and to be distributed, but they had been printing them and distributing them. Great works from the West of liberty by such authors as Murray Rothbard, Ludwig von Mises, Milton Friedman. And before that evening was over, I asked the printers if there was anything I could do to help them. And one of them said, yes, we have a project in mind. If you can raise $5,000, we can tell you how to get it to our contacts in Paris. They will then get it to us. And with that money, we will translate and print Milton Friedman's Free to Choose. In fact, it's in the next room. I wish I had thought to put it right here so I could show you. So I raised that money all from one single donor very quickly. And later the underground activists involved with it got a copy to me. And it's one of the most cherished possessions that I have.
What about this detainment by Polish police?
Yeah, I thought during my whole trip that I had gotten away with it, that the Polish government did not discover what I was up to, but there must have been something that I did somewhere that raised their suspicions, because when I went to leave the country, at the airport at Warsaw, I got to the passport desk and the gentleman looked at my passport, got on the telephone, and I knew something was up. And then 3 uniformed and armed men came over, and that began about a 2.5-hour experience of being interrogated, searched, strip searched, as a matter of fact. My film and tapes were confiscated. Meantime, the person that I had brought with me to serve as a photographer, he was allowed on the plane. So I didn't see him for a while, and I didn't know if the plane had taken off without me, how long I would be detained or what. But after that 2.5-hour period, I learned that they had kept the plane on the ground the whole time. And then they decided to put me on it, and then they stamped my passport with the word "Nalavano." And then when I got to Paris and showed that to Polish emigres, they looked at it and they cheered. They said, "Ah, you're one of us." That's a stamp of approval from the resistance when the government says "Nalavano" in your passport. And so they didn't allow me to come back to Poland until the communists were gone in June of 1989. I tried many times. My visa was rejected every time. And Senator Steve Sims of the state of Idaho, who was a good friend, petitioned the Polish government, the embassy in Washington every month, demanding the release of my materials. And finally, in the summer of 1989, with the communists gone, I got my materials back. And then in November of that year, I was able to come to Poland again and to celebrate the freedoms that Polish people had won.
Yet Poland was not the most dangerous of your travels. You were in Nicaragua during the civil war in 1991, spending time with the rebel forces there. So question here, when people rebel against power, usually they just want different ruler. Seems like really nobody's ever fought or raised a rebellion to be free in those purely economic terms, like free from compulsion and also free to make mistakes, right?
Yes.
So even our Polish solidarity movement was based on rather socialistic ideas. Why do you think is it so? What's the reason for that?
Well, of course, there are notable exceptions. The founding of the United States it was very much rooted in a desire to be genuinely free. But you're right, throughout history, most of the time people become disgruntled with the current regime and then simply want to replace it with a different one, especially if they can somehow personally be involved and be among the rulers. I think there's something about human nature that we always have to fight. The desire for power, and also at the same time, the desire for perceived security. You know, there are a lot of people who they don't really want to have power, but they want to be secure. They want the government there to give them things, to provide them security and so forth. And then there are the others who they want to be the government and be in charge and push other people around. So those are some pretty bad habits that humanity has shown time and time again. It's something that through education, through understanding, through a respect for the lives and the property and the choices of other people, I think we can overcome. But it's very tough because most of the time in history, people either want to be in power or they want something from power.
Mm-hmm. Have your travels in general taught you anything about free markets or about liberty? And was it rather positive, or maybe they gave you sort of doubts about all those blessings of economic freedom?
Well, I've been such a firm believer in freedom since my teenage years that the only doubts I've ever had have been brief and have been basically around the notion of, how soon might the forces of freedom win. Sometimes I have doubts that it may be soon, but then, in 1989, how many people predicted that before the end of the year that the Soviet Union would begin its inexorable collapse, and we would see the liberation of so many of its captive nations. So I don't rule anything out. People are creatures of ideas. They can change the course of history if they change from bad ideas to good ideas. And so everywhere I have gone in all my travels, I come away just amazed at what freedom can accomplish, even a little bit of it. In 1989, I also went to Cambodia, and that was a country I was expecting to see the Stone Age in, because they had been occupied by the Vietnamese for 10 years. Before that, they were ruled by the most brutal communist regime in the 20th century, the Khmer Rouge. So I expected that to see tremendous hardship and poverty. And of course, there was plenty of that. But I also saw, with a little bit of freedom, already Cambodia was coming alive. The markets in inner city Phnom Penh, where farmers for the first time in 15 years were allowed to grow what they wanted, sell at whatever price they could command. Those markets were coming alive. People were smiling. I thought to myself, wow, even a little bit of freedom goes a long way.
Do you sometimes have thoughts like that? Well, this is something market cannot do. Let's leave it to the state.
Oh, I can't remember the last time I thought that, simply because I have such faith in what people can accomplish when they have the incentive to do so, when they don't have the ability to turn to power to try to get something, when they're on their own in a society where they have to respect the lives and property of others. They tend to go bananas, for production and creativity and entrepreneurship. That's why I say a little bit of that, a little bit of freedom can go a very long way. So I'm an undying optimist when it comes to what can be accomplished when people are left alone to be themselves. I think the sky's the limit.
But now we are witnessing an unprecedented situation where almost all, at least mainstream economists, agree that we need state to save us. They print money, go into more debt to ensure the economy keeps going. Is that, given those exceptional pandemic circumstances, justified?
Well, perhaps the pandemic justifies, in the name of defense of life, a certain extraordinary and very temporary measures. I think they've gone too far in many cases. The lockdowns now, I think it's becoming quite apparent that on balance, they did more harm than good. We will probably look back in another year or two and come to a much better, more complete assessment of the measures to combat the pandemic. And I think that we will look back and say, once again, reliance upon the state, when everybody thought because of an emergency we had no choice, proved to have serious downsides. Maybe we will learn enough from this pandemic to know that the next time a greater reliance on freedom and less reliance on the state would be the better answer. Of course, the long run costs of the massive expansion of government expenditures has yet to be felt. So, maybe it'll take 5 or 10 years before we look back and say, oh my gosh, look at all this debt we have. Look at all this massive government and spending that we did. What have we got to show for it? Maybe the pandemic might have ended, roughly about the same time without all those measures. I don't think the jury has rendered its verdict yet on state action in the pandemic.
Well, one of the most famous economic historian and also a free market proponent, I guess he's even an anarcho-capitalist, Robert Hicks, observed that state has this tendency to practice, quote, old trick of turning every contingency into a resource for accumulating force.
Yes.
And it's called ratchet effect, right?
Yeah.
So
yes.
Don't you think that this will be the result of the pandemic? And
there's no
all
question.
those tools that are being implemented right now.
Yeah, I mean, I know Bob Higgs. I have great respect for him, and he is so right when he talks about how government takes every contingency and turns it into an emergency and a reason for it to grow. And then after the emergency is passed, whether its own measures helped to make that happen or not, it never goes back to the size and the degree of activity that it had before the crisis. That's a very unfortunate commentary on the state and on what humans will allow it to do. So I think it's quite likely that that will be an outcome. I just hope that people will come to their senses and realize, hey, we need to start ratcheting in the other direction. Otherwise, the end result of this never-ending ratchet effect of soaring government will be to give us someday total government. And I can't imagine anybody in his right mind who would want that. So maybe there's a ratchet effect in the other direction. If you get enough people who believe in liberty and free markets and will resist the expansion of the state.
But, you know, what we see now is the rise of this quite powerful narrative that pandemic and its scope is great scope, that, you know, pandemic is all over the world, is also due to globalization. And a lot of intellectuals, a lot of economists, a lot of public figures say that we just went too far with globalization. We went too far with mass traveling, for example, and so on. And that's why we need to limit that. So that is kind of a powerful argument working against freedom, not for it.
Yeah, but of course I would disagree with that. I think if you try to turn that around and reduce or end the globalization of the economy of the world that we've seen in recent decades, you will do that at a cost of massive levels of poverty. I mean, let's not forget that globalization has been a major reason why something like 2 billion people or more have been lifted out of a state of miserable poverty. I mean, that's a record for human accomplishment. That has meant the reduction of many diseases and people living longer and fewer deaths at an early age. So if you want to undo that, you're going to suffer the consequences, and they will be dire. So I don't think government has any business preventing people from entering into exchanges with others, traveling to meet others. The only time there may be some need to restrict that is momentarily during a pandemic so as to keep people safe. But otherwise, at the earliest opportunity, if we want our economies to grow, we want to liberate people to be free to travel and to get to know others and engage in peaceful transactions.
You invested basically whole of your life into promoting economic freedom and market liberalism. So are you happy with the result? I am asking since I have the already mentioned Robert Hicks among my Facebook friends, and almost every day I see his posts in which he admits this way or another that his efforts to educate people were just hopeless. So are you a pessimist too? Because you said that you are an optimist, obviously, when it comes to the power of market. But now I'm asking you about your real conviction about the direction into which the world is going.
No, I am always an eternal optimist. I don't see the point in pessimism. Pessimism sort of says, I know the future and it's bad, so I'm going to stop working to make it better. Well, that guarantees that it won't be any better. It disarms you. It demoralizes you. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people who believe in liberty just give up because they think they know that the future is bad, all that does is guarantee that it will be bad. So I think what we should ask ourselves, each of us, is, am I doing all that I can, as best as I can, to advance the cause and the values of liberty? If not, then I need to work better at it, work harder at it, and let the chips fall where they may. I mean, I don't fret about the future. I don't know exactly what it holds, but I do know that I'm in charge of what I can do to help make it better. And that's what I'm always looking to improve.
We had a discussion recently, and that might be a conclusion for our talk. We had a discussion here at Warsaw Enterprise Institute on how to present people to the ideas of classical liberalism or to the ideas of free market itself. And there was kind of a split between two ways of thinking. One strategy proposed by one guy was we are not supposed to talk anymore, because all we do as think tanks, and we are talking and talking and talking, and nothing goes out of it. There is no real material result. Maybe we should just become capitalists. Maybe we should show by example what is market liberalism in practice, not in theory. Which of those two strategies would you choose?
Oh, that's a very good question. You know, there's the academic approach, which is purely, write a paper and throw it out the window and hope that somebody will read it. That's the last thing we should do. We need to be focused on marketing, persuasion. And for some people, that means entering the world of entrepreneurship and showing by example and by marketing an exciting product or service that free markets can make a difference in people's lives. But we still have to persuade. We still have to engage people in terms of ideas to get them to think differently. And the best way to do that is to spend at least as much time on how we say our message as to than the message itself. So many people think, well, we just need to write it up and walk away. But no, that's when the work should begin. We need to engage people in ways that bring a smile to their face, that make them say, wow, I hadn't thought of that before. We need to find ways to make ourselves as personalities more appealing to other people. So they will say, wow, you seem to have something important to say. Let me listen. Too many people, especially in academia, don't do that. They have no sense for marketing. And so they wonder why they lose. So I'd say work on the presentation side, the effective marketing, and the vehicle, whether it's video or the printed word or the spoken word. We can always do better in how we attract others to our cause.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reed, for your time. Hopefully we will meet again in person, because we had already a chance to meet some years ago here in Warsaw. Hopefully this craziness will end soon and you'll be here, or I'll be there. Have a good day.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. I hope to see you in Poland in 2021.